everyone. Welcome to the world of podcast statistics. So I'm Raven, one of your co-hosts for the event. So together with me, Ramus, we are both hosting this together. And our trainer today is, of course, Nathaniel. So which I'll be introducing very shortly. But first, I would like to talk a bit more about the Asian Podcast Festival. Okay. So this is our second year of launching since 2019. So the Asia Podcast Festival is a celebration and recognition of podcast excellence in Asia. It brings together the best in the industry and provides a sandbox for emerging talents to grow and experiment. So this festival has two organizers. One is Creatives at Work and one is Vox Live. So Creatives at Work is a media agency supercharged by a curated network of freelance media professionals who cover every consumer touch point, such as digital, social, mobile, broadcast, print, events, and out of home. So Vox Live is a podcast production house. It gives content creators an audio advantage to stand out in the podcast crowd. We help aspiring podcasters to reduce time to launch, increase your listenership, and build a sustainable podcast. Sorry. Okay, sorry, I just had to mute someone for the moment. Okay. All within your budget. And we also run events for podcasters such as this Asian Podcast Festival. So there are 4 pillars for the Asian Podcast Festival. Be the Pop Lab, which is the master classes and the workshops we are attending now. And then there's the awards, which is a competition to recognize the best in the industry. There's a conference with key industry players in the podcasting field, and also a marketplace for the podcast ecosystem as well. So the Asian Podcast Award celebrates the best in Asian podcasting by creating a platform to recognize and honor the members of the Asian podcasting community. We'll empower Asian voices and share our stories and diversity with the rest of the world. So next slide. So for the criteria, we are open to Asian podcasters. So entries are in all Asian language, which makes us pretty special in terms of other podcast competitions out there, which are pretty much restricted to the English language medium. So whether your podcast is in Chinese, Bahasa, Tamil, Hindi, Vietnamese, Korean, we got you covered. So the criteria is that your podcast has to be active in 2021. So that means you have to publish at least one episode, or at least a couple of episodes in 2021. So the due date is 21st November. So there are 6 categories. I think Podcaster of the Year, Host of the Year, Best Comedy, Entertainment and Lifestyle, Science, Tech, Business, Narrative, Storytelling, Arts, Society and Culture. So next slide. So for more information, you can go to the website. And now, okay. Let me introduce the speaker for today, which you have already met, which is Nathaniel. Yay! So really very excited. I knew him for a couple of years, and I've seen what a great job he has done, in developing the podcast for tech in Asia. So he's the resident podcaster of the Singapore-based online company Tech in Asia. I hope you know who they are, where he hosts Startup Snapshot, a podcast that tells the story of entrepreneurs from across the region about the pivotal moments that shaped them into who they are today. So since launching the show in 2019, Nat has launched 2 spin-off series, Deep Dive, where he discussed the biggest headlines to hit Tech in Asia's front page with the journalists who break the stories, and the now-defunct the Weekly Snapshot. He also produces limited podcast series for Tech in Asia partners who want to connect with Asian tech and startup audience. So now I'll give the mic over to the virtual mic over to Ned for him to introduce himself and start the workshop. Over to you.
All right. Ned. Thank you so much, Raven. Let me just share my screen right now. Okay. Sweet. Thanks everyone for attending this workshop. Like Raven introduced, my name is Nat, and we're going to discuss how to create a killer content strategy for your podcast. So I'm not sure how many of you actually have a podcast already, how many of you are just interested in it, have been toying with the idea for a while, or if some of you have had podcasts for a few years already. But what the purpose of today is to make sure that at the end of this, for those who didn't know where to start, we're going to give you a start. And for those who already have a podcast, we're going to refine your content strategy process. So, like Raven introduced, I am the managing editor at Tech Ninja Studios. Essentially, what that means is I work with businesses to reach the tech and startup audience via the Tech Ninja webpage. And what I did, I joined Tech Ninja about 3 years ago. And then after a year, I launched Startup Snapshot. So 2 years ago, I launched Startup Snapshot. It's on Spotify. You can get it on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And then after a while after that, I launched a spin-off series called Deep Dive, where, like Raven mentioned, we talk about the news as opposed to profiling people. And I also do help other businesses such as Grab to launch their own podcast, depending on their marketing objectives, their content objectives. So that is, in a nutshell, me. So let's look at what we're going to learn today. First, identifying and understanding your audience. Then we're going to design a concept for your show, and then find the topics that resonate with your audience. Look for your perfect podcast guest. Review and refine the whole content strategy process for success. And then we're going to touch a little bit on drafting a basic podcast script. So we're going to touch on this one by one. But first, identifying and understand your audience. First, it starts with you and your audience, right? So when you want to think about your audience and who that audience is, the first thing you have to do is think about who you are, because you need to understand yourself before you understand your audience. Only when you know who you are will you know who your audience should be. Because if you're someone who is detached from your audience, why would that audience listen to you, right? Why would they listen to your podcast? So these are some of the questions you need to consider. Who are you? Why should someone listen to you? How are you unique? What subjects are you the expert on? And that's very important, because when you sound like you know what you're talking about, you gain credibility with your listeners. And credibility leads to loyalty and increased listenership and engagement. So that's very important. What values define you? So when you're very passionate about a topic, for example, listeners can hear it in your voice, because you get excited about it, you raise your tone, you're very energetic when you speak about it. But when you're talking about stuff that don't really align with your values, then you'd have to convince yourself that you align with that before convincing your audience. So think about what values define you, and what your mission is, because podcasting is quite a long and difficult process, and you need to find the meaning that this work brings to you for it to be sustainable, right? So I guess to give an example of how these questions came about in my own journey, when I started the podcast at Tech in Asia, I already had a set audience that I wanted to capitalize on, because as a publication, we were already catering to the tech and startup audience, entrepreneurs, startup founders. But I had to ask myself all of these questions to determine what kind of podcast I would be offering to this audience, right? So when I asked myself who I was, I'd only been covering the tech scene, the startup scene for about a year, not established, not a name that is known in the scene. So I can't do like a personality driven podcast. I can't do one where it's commentary based on like my expert opinion. I am not the bona fide expert on startups and technology, because I'd only been in the scene for a year. But my mission was very clearly to highlight startup stories. So that led me to really come up with the idea for Startup Snapshot, in which we tell the stories that have not been told in the tech and startup scene. So that's kind of like my journey and like understanding myself and how that fits. What I want you guys to do now is take 5 minutes to reflect on these questions, write them down somewhere, put them in the notebook, or type it in your desktop. I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes to do that, and then hopefully we'll get some people to share on their answers to these questions. So go ahead and take 5 minutes first to answer these questions.
Sorry, Ned, when you say who are you, do you mean like as a person or as like the podcast, like a personification of the podcast?
It's you as a person. So you as Nicholas, basically. So your podcast is an extension of you. Before you have that podcast, who are you as a person? Now we still have about 3.5 minutes, but just in case you guys are stuck at who are you and how are you unique, because a lot of times people find it very difficult to say why they stand out from everyone else. Think about what excites you, right? What hobbies do you have? What do you do in your downtime? What do you do in your uptime? What is your favorite food, your favorite cuisine? What keeps you up at night? What gets you up in the morning?
Ned, I think we have new people coming in. Do you want to repeat the instructions for them again?
Yes. Okay. So to the new people coming in, we're going on a little bit of a self-discovery journey to understand who we are so we know who our audience is. So take some time to answer these questions. We have a little bit under a minute left. So just some quick internal discovery.
Hi, Ned. Can I ask?
Yeah, Reynold, what's up?
Yeah. So I was wondering if you have an example of, for example, in your own experience with Tech in Asia, what are these values that you have?
Right.
Yeah.
So values is not something that I applied to my first podcast, but it's something that I thought about when I was creating a podcast for Grab. So Grab, some background, Grab approached us earlier this year in March and February to promote diversity in the workplace, right? Because International Women's Day is in March, and they wanted to ride on an International Women's Day campaign. So the value that we rode on for that podcast was empowering women, for example. So values is a very loose term. You can kind of use anything you want. Values could mean anything from like you know how Ellen always ends her show with like be nice or something like that, and or some people, they just like to some political podcast, maybe like they will have like their own plugs in that is the value that defines them. So you don't have to have values defining you if you don't know what it means to you yet. You can discover that along the way, but it's important at least to get started thinking on that.
All right, thank you.
No worries. I think we've spent enough time on these questions. So can I get someone to share some of the answers to these questions? Do I have a volunteer who might be willing to share who they are? Introduce yourself to the class.
Hi.
Hi.
Sure. Hello. I'm Nicholas.
Okay.
So who I am, I'm just a guy who I'm into a lot of things, but particularly storytelling. So I guess I hope that answers the first question very roughly. Why should someone listen to me? Because it's fun and you'll discover a lot of new things. That's number two. Number three, how am I unique? I think I'm very personality driven. I think my voice is pretty unique as well. So that's two. And next question, what subjects are you an expert on? Storytelling, D&D, talking to people, making people feel comfortable. I think that's what. And then my values are passion, discovery, and collective fun. And my mission is to put a smile on someone's face. Yeah. So that's just simply my jam.
All right. Thanks, Nicholas. Did you say D&D just now?
Yeah. I was thinking of doing a D&D podcast as well. Yes.
That's amazing. I would totally love to listen to that once you get that started. Okay, so that's a very good example. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for sharing your answers to these questions. That's a very good example of how you can get started with this. As you can see, you don't have to get super deep into it, like who are you, and then you list your whole resume. All you have to do is just anchor on one thing, like Nicholas loves storytelling, and that's great. That's a start. All right, so that's the first step done to understanding your audience. You understand yourself now, and now you have to think about who your audience is, right? So based on who you are, who do you think would be your audience for your potential podcast, right? And this can be defined by the littlest things, like when or what time your audience is likely to be listening to your show, or in what mood they are when they're listening to your show, because that can help inform you on what you want to talk about. So these questions again, who are they? Who is your audience? What does a day in their life look like? Think about, when they wake up in the morning all the way when they go to bed. Like, what does that? Where is the space where you can get them to listen to a podcast? What are their experiences? What are their needs and their wants? What problems do they face? What excites and inspires them? And what do they value? Right? So, for example, in my experience, when I started out Startup Snapshot, I had to think about my target audience of entrepreneurs and people who work in startups. And when I think about what a day in their life looks like, you don't really see people consuming business content on the weekends or like at night or after work, because their mind is switched off from wanting to think more about business. So typically, I would know that they're probably listening when they're on the commute on the way to work, probably on a Monday, to get them back into the whole vibe of the work life. Their experiences being that they run a business, they run a team of people, they're solving a need in the market, and what their needs and wants, what problems they face. What I identified at the time was that they did not have stories of failure to assure them that failure was okay. Right. So what I thought was important was to focus on showcasing stories of business failures and how that's not the end, and helping people learn from those. Because often when it comes to businesses, they don't want to highlight their mistakes, they want to highlight their successes, which is all fine. But that just means that for business leaders, it's hard for them to find a solution to a problem that they might be facing. What excites and inspires them? Business successes. So these are what I considered when I started my podcast. We're going to get to this, but what will help with answering these questions rather than just answering these straight up is this thing called an empathy map canvas, right? So it's a step-by-step process, I guess, to understanding who your audience is. You're going to go from number one. If you look at the top left quadrant, who are we empathizing with? You have to empathize with your audience to understand them. Who is this person that you want to understand? What is the situation that they are in? What is their role in that situation? Then you go into what they need to do. What is it that they do differently? What jobs they want to get done? What decisions they need to make? How they define success, for example. What do they see? What is it that they see in their life? This is where it's very helpful to understand what a day in their life looks like. What they say, what they do, what they hear. And then finally, the most important one is what they think and feel, what their fears, frustrations, and anxieties are, and conversely, what their wants, needs, hopes, and dreams are, and what other thoughts and feelings might be motivating them in their day-to-day. So what we're going to do now is take a little bit more time, because there's a few more points here. Take 10 minutes to fill this up. Spend just about a minute or two on each step. If you are stuck on a step, feel free to skip it and go to the next one, because we don't have to dive deep into this. This is more like a few hours long activity for like teams of marketers to consider, but we're appropriating this for content strategy. So go ahead and take 10 minutes. I'm gonna start a timer so that I can keep track of this. And if anyone has any questions about any of these things, feel free to just ask in the chat as well. Or just unmute yourself and just ask. Okay, so just for anyone who might wanna continue this activity at home, well, we're all at home, but after the session, I sent a link to the image where you can download it and you can continue there. But do take the time to fill this up. I think we have about 7 more minutes. If you happen to be stuck on any of these points, one thing that could help you answer those is to think about how someone would answer it for you. So for example, if someone needed to empathize with you, what is your situation? What do you do? What do you need to do? What do you see, say, hear? What do you think and feel? Okay, we're about halfway through the 10 minutes. Can I get a indication in the chat if anyone is struggling or anyone is less than halfway through your empathy map canvas? If no one says anything, I think.
Sorry, Nat, I think we have new people again.
Oh, okay.
Can you just like, I think they don't have time, but can you just like quickly repeat
Of
the
course.
exercise? Yeah.
So for the new people, thank you. Welcome to the session. Thank you for taking the time here. What we're doing right now is filling in an empathy map canvas that will help us understand our ideal podcast audience. So right before this, we already did another similar exercise where we answered some questions about who we are and what makes us unique. And this follow-up activity will help us find the intersection between ourselves and our audience. So I did send a link in the chat for downloading this empathy map canvas. But honestly, you could just Google empathy map canvas and this will probably be the first image that shows up. And you can use that if you don't have the time today to be able to identify your audience and understand them better. If we do still have about like 3 more minutes, so go ahead and take the time filling up as much as you can. The important one, I think, would be point 7. So if you get stuck from points 1 through 6, go ahead and go to 7 and fill in pains and gains. Raven, in the meantime, I got a question here whether the session's recorded and whether the slides will be sent to the participants.
Okay. So the session is recorded. It's actually more for our auditing purpose, but because we make a mistake, if Nathaniel, if you don't mind, I will share this recording for those of people who have missed out, because I understand that some of you have missed out up to 30 minutes. So Nat, if you're okay with it, I will share the recording with the participants.
Definitely.
Yeah. As for the slides, or I think it's up to you to decide. Yeah.
Yeah, I can send it over to you and
okay.
can send it over in bulk. So Jeremiah will be sending over as much of the content of today as possible.
Yeah. Jeremiah, I'm so sorry about that. I just saw your message. I'm so sorry for the technical hiccups. But yeah, you will get access to the recording and the deck as well. Thank you.
Anyway, Jeremiah, don't worry. We're only like at the beginning of the session. So the exciting activities are to come. This one is just to get us grounded and to understand where to start from. Okay, we got about 1 more minute. Does anyone need any more time, or is anyone struggling anywhere? All right, so we've had some time to think about this. Can anybody tell me a little bit about how you feel about who your audience is? Do you get a better idea of them? Can someone share some of the things that you filled in for your empathy map canvas?
I can share if it isn't hogging.
Well, I think it's fine, unless anyone wants to share, but I think you can break the ice. So Nicholas, tell us how you filled in your empathy map canvas.
Yeah, so I'm actually running, thinking of running another podcast, so it's a separate one. But this one is about people who don't have passions in their life. So who am I empathizing with? I think, hold on, let me get it up. Corporate shills, passionless people, bored people, basically. So that's the target audience. A lot of the times, what do they need to do? They need to kind of break out of their cycle of like 9 to 5, just go home and sleep and watch Netflix, that kind of thing. And they need to discover what it is like they want to do for fun or like outside of their work. What they see, I think one thing is that there's too many options out there. A lot of them have analysis paralysis, like should I go hiking this weekend or like yoga or whatever. They're not sure what is right for them as well in terms of like hobbies to pick up. You know, they see a lot of people doing different things. like friends doing yoga, but they might not feel like it's right for them. Then for the fourth one, what do they say? I think a lot of the common things are like, oh, there's nothing to do in Singapore. I don't have any passions. Or like when you ask them how your weekend is, they say like nothing much, just the usual. Yeah, I think that's the target audience. Then for number 5, what do they do? They're either like in corporate or like student. So it's very 9 to 5, very cyclical, normal, boring routines. And they need to break out of that. Number 6, what do they hear? I guess a lot of it is on social media. They see like a lot of their friends who are out there doing a lot of things, but they're just at home, and they don't feel like those activities are right for them, or things like, oh, where got time to do X activity or Y activity, or they're too tired. Yeah. Some pains they have probably are things like I don't want to live a very boring and pointless life. Other people are doing a lot of things, but I'm not. There's that FOMO. I feel bad that I don't do the same things as other people do, like yoga or hiking, things like that. Gains, I guess, they will discover something that's fulfilling for themselves. They'll discover ways to make their life, make them enjoy life better, and also to discover new hobbies and skills. Yeah, that's me.
All right, very nice. So thank you very much, Nicholas, for sharing again. And that's, again, a very good example of how you can fill in that empathy map canvas. As you can see, it really helps to narrow down who your audience is, what their habits are like, and how you potentially might help them, which is the next step. So the next step to understanding your audience is understanding what part you play in your relationship with your audience. Right. So there are some key questions to consider in this, right? What values and experiences you both share, what you have that they want, and what your role in that podcaster audience relationship is. Like with you speaking into a mic and then them downloading that audio file later on, what role is that playing? Are you companion? Are you a teacher? Are you inspiring them? So these are some stuff to consider. I think what we're gonna do instead is skip over this because these 3 questions I think are pretty easy to answer once you have answered the previous 2 sets of questions. So what that will lead you to once you understand your relationship with your audience, because you understand yourself and your audience, is now we can start on your concept, the topics, and your guests in your podcast. So this is the exciting stuff. And first, you have to start with the concept of your podcast, right? So you start with using something like this content matrix, where you decide whether you're going to entertain, inspire, educate, or convince your audience. And this goes back to your relationship with your audience. What is it that your content does for them, right? So are you appealing to your audience rationally, meaning that you're educating them or convincing them to do something? Or are you appealing to them emotionally, where you're entertaining them, maybe with a comedy podcast, inspiring them with stories of other human beings that have made it in the world? So this as well doesn't, your show doesn't have to be set in stone in where you place it on this content matrix. Oftentimes you will place your content, your pin on the top left quadrant of the content matrix. You think you want to entertain, but then you realize that maybe you're not so entertaining, but you are pretty inspiring of a person. So you might shift it to the right a bit. And that's totally fine. It also might depend on what kind of audience you're going after, because when you're entertaining or educating, that tends to gear towards a more general audience. Which is larger, but there's also a lot more competition to capture that general audience. Because if you're running a podcast on maybe like just a comedy podcast, there are so many other comedy podcasts out there, and you're not just competing with people in Singapore, you're competing with people around the world, right? Whereas if you're looking to inspire or convince someone, typically you already have a more narrow, you already have a more specified target audience. in which that's very small, it's niche. So you're looking to inspire, for example, board people, corporate shills, or you're looking to convince people to increase diversity in the workplace. Those are very specific target audiences, but you appeal to them, either emotionally or rationally. So one example of how it isn't set in stone where you layer podcasts. For Startup Snapshot, the whole purpose first was to inspire, right? I started this podcast as a way to highlight stories of failure and how failure isn't the end for businesses. But then a few months later, I launched a spin-off show, Deep Dive, because I realized that in just inspiring, I am leaving out a lot of the content matrix, and that is a need of my audience that is not being fulfilled. So in Deep Dive, I decided to educate. So the entire opposite spectrum of this matrix, in which instead of talking about people, the human stories, I talk to journalists about the stories that they cover on the tech and startup scene. So in that way, I'm able to fulfill not just inspiring founders who might be on the brink of failure, but also educating just the general audience of tech and startup professionals who want to learn more about the industry, learn more about the scene. So yeah, you can take a screenshot of this, think about it. We'll send you the slides anyway, but this is something that will help you decide the concept of your show, right? You have to think about where your content falls under. That's what we're gonna do right now. Come up with your concept. So what you're gonna do is just brainstorm as many show concepts and episode topics as possible based on how you drafted out your understanding of yourself and your understanding of your audience. And then add as well some ideal guests that you would like to have. And this is just brainstorming, so just go wild with this. If you want to invite Elon Musk on your podcast, that's entirely fine as well. I'm not going to say that it's not possible. So spend 5 minutes working on concepts, 1 concept, 2, 3 concepts. But if you hit the 5-minute mark, then spend the next 5 minutes thinking about the topics for those different concepts and the guests that would appear in those concepts, in those episodes. So go ahead and do that right now. We're gonna start a clock for about 10 minutes. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to pump them in the chat or to just unmute yourself and ask away. Also, I want to remind everyone that this is a brainstorming activity, so there are no bad ideas here. All you have to do is throw everything that comes in your mind into a box and just start writing things down. If you find yourself stuck coming up with your concept, look back on your notes about yourself, your notes about your audience. Try to make connections between the two of you. Like, what characteristics do you share? What hobbies do you share, maybe? Or where you differ? Because people don't only listen to people that are like them. People listen to the type of people that they want to be, for example. So that will probably help you, be able to think of your concepts a little better. Okay, we're reaching about 5 minutes. So if you're still working on your concepts, try to finish off the last one and then move on to the different topics that you want to explore in those concepts, in those show concepts. What episode topic would you have? Spend the next 5 minutes thinking about that. If you're finding yourself a little stuck on what topics to pursue, you can switch it around and think about the guest first and what topic that guest might be good for and whether that fits your concept. So feel free to work backwards as well. Also, if anyone is here from the Scape program, Jeremiah's asking if you guys want to start WhatsApp or a Tele group. So go ahead and do that. I find that when I was starting my podcast, people like Raven, people at the Podcast Festival Asia in 2019 were very helpful in helping me figure out my next steps and helping me figure out how I can evolve my podcast. So I think that's very good to do. It's always easier to grow as a community than growing by yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Nat, for sharing that. Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. If you can build your own community, that would be the best to do. Yeah, so I hope that for those in the Escape program, I hope you guys will come together and set out your own community. to help each other and to support each other.
Okay, we got a little bit under a minute more to go. So try to wrap up your last few topics and your guests. Don't worry if you can't finish this right now. Once you guys get together on your WhatsApp or Tele channels, it was very helpful for me to bounce ideas off other podcasters and see what they think about it. Because honestly, with how early podcasting is right now, the people that listen to podcasts the most are other podcasters. So they would be a good listening board to sound off ideas on. Okay, I think we're just about 10 minutes. Let's get some people sharing their concepts right now. Does anyone want to share some of your concepts or some of your topics? Doesn't have to be a complete one, even just an incomplete one. Maybe you might be able to complete them sounding them off right now. Or does everyone want to keep their shows a secret until they launch?
Yes, I highly encourage you guys to share. You have Ned in the house. Please do share, guys. This is your opportunity to run your ideas
Hi
with it.
guys.
Yeah.
Hi guys, I'm Inshira.
Hi,
Hi,
You
Inshira.
guys hear me? Yeah, you guys can call me Insi too. So okay, I kind of brainstorm like some stuff like pretty quickly. I don't know whether it's like substantial, but so I was actually fascinated. I was fascinated with the true crime genre because I feel like in Singapore there's a lack of actually like podcasts that talk about true crime. Most of it is like either very informative, like a 938 FM kind of format, or like more towards the entertainment side where people just give social commentary. So I thought of having a concept that combines both together. So in terms of like interviewing people, I was also fascinated with people that went missing, that kind of thing. So I thought like maybe I could interview with family members of the missing person, or maybe like reporters that broke the news of the crime, or like even like if they were from a certain location, people working around that location and things like that lah. So that was my first topic that I was interested in. Yeah. And then the second topic that I was thinking about was actually love stories. So I feel like a lot of people have a lot of experiences when it comes to love, and like no one experience is unique. No one experience is the same for everyone. Everyone has a different experience. So I thought I could interview like people who were facing different things in their life, like maybe like someone who broke up, or maybe someone who's already in a committed like 5-year relationship kind of thing. And then like finally, maybe like for like a topic about consent, I could have like a bunch of friends that come together, and then they will just share their ideas about how they feel about consent and whether it's being practiced among people and stuff like that. So that was the second topic that I thought about. And then the last one is actually mental health. So I feel like a lot of people don't really open up about themselves. So I was looking into like about self. So maybe about somebody who was struggling with their sense of self. So I could actually interview them to actually have them share their experiences and how they feel about certain things. And then like also like I feel like for mental health, like stress is also like another issue. So maybe I can interview people who have like stressful jobs, but then they somehow manage to like get themselves afloat and handle their stresses well. And then also like the third, maybe like to inspire people so like maybe interview people with very different tastes and very different hobbies, so they can also like share their experiences and to inspire other people to try something new if they feel like the certain environment that they are in is not conducive for them now. So that was what I thought of. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Insi.
sorry.
I think
Okay.
that's wonderful.
Okay.
Those are some very great ideas. I think those are something that I would definitely want to listen to. So good job. And I hope that helps everyone also see that, can start with just one little small idea, but then once you start thinking about it, you have so much potential to explore in that
Right,
small
right.
concept.
Thank
So
you.
yes, thank you so much, Insi. So let's move on to the next step, because coming up with your concept is just one part of starting your podcast, right? Because you might have a few concepts now, but how do you know which one will work, right? For example, Insi, she had about 3 concepts. So which one of those should she pursue? So the next one that we're going to talk about is refining and testing your ideas for success. And the first way you can do that is by using data, right? So these are some of my favorite tools that I use to ideate show concepts. They're called social listening tools. They basically look at like search engines or like social media activity to determine what people are saying about a topic or how many people are thinking about a topic, right? So Google Trends, BuzzSumo, Answer the Public is a great one. So I'm going to show you guys a few examples of how I use Google Trends, for example. A while back, I was thinking with the launch of the McCrispy in Singapore that it wasn't actually a new product. It's an old product that came back onto the shelves. So I thought, wow, there's a show idea here for the McCrispy conspiracy. Why did McDonald's take it off the shelves in the early 2000s or the late 90s? Because at the time, it was one of their most popular products, right? But at the time I was thinking about this, it was about 2 months ago. And when I checked Google Trends, 2 months ago was way too late to be doing a McCrispy podcast. If I had done this in June, I could be riding the wave. I could be the podcast to know about what happened to the McCrispy in the 1990s or the early 2000s and why it's back now. But, a little bit late to the trend. So I thought about, what other food-related stuff might be interesting to talk about. And I just input bubble tea. And look how consistently popular bubble tea is in terms of search results on Google. Everyone's always looking for bubble tea. Bubble tea is a trend that will never die, unfortunately, unlike the McCrispy. So should you be podcasting about the McCrispy? Maybe not. Should you podcast about bubble tea? Maybe, right? So you can try this out for yourselves at trends.google.com if you want to have a hand at this. So another tool that I want to show how it works is Answer the Public. This is basically where you can input one topic and you can understand or you can get a glimpse at what people are saying about it, what people are asking about it. So at answerthepublic.com, for example, if you've recently been looking at like Facebook's rebrand to Meta and all this talk about the metaverse and its relation to NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and you're thinking, maybe I can ride the wave of this hype right now and start a podcast idea. Then what I did is I input non-fungible tokens into Answer the Public, and all of this came out. So now you can identify not just what topic to talk about, but how to talk about the topic. Because you can see that people are asking, when did non-fungible tokens start? What are non-fungible tokens used for? Are non-fungible tokens bad for the environment? These are great examples to really get you started thinking on specifics for your topics and for your show concepts. So these social listening tools are not the only things that you would need to use to consider how you might refine your podcast ideas. There are a few questions to think about as well, right? There's a lot of questions, a lot of asking yourself a lot of questions when it comes to building a podcast. So first, should your story be told via audio, right? Because some stories, they're great to read, but honestly, they're a little bit of a bore to listen to. In my experience, I about 2 years ago, when I had just started Startup Snapshot, I had a founder of a blockchain company come on the show to talk about the strategy that this company was taking to solve the problem with blockchain's scalability. And those were a lot of words that I did not understand at the time. Clearly, a lot of words that my audience also was not so into, because that episode tanked. Our listener retention was so bad. Our listener count was really bad as well. But we had articles on that founder and on his business that were performing very well. So maybe it's just because his story shouldn't have been one that's told by audio. It's something that needs a little bit of a visual aid to understand and really get integrated in. You should also think about whether someone has already done your podcast idea. And this is like the idea killer for a lot of podcasts, because then you have to consider the fact that you are starting a new podcast, coming into a space where there is an established podcaster. And then why would someone listen to a newer podcast if it's just the same as the established podcast, right? So then if you don't really want to kill your idea, you think it's really good, there's potential there, think about how you can tweak it to add new perspectives to old discussions, or how you might add a little bit of flavor to it that the established podcasts don't really have, right? What are the gaps in the market that you can fill in, right? Think about how multiple different guests as well would be able to add more value to your topics. For example, I had a story once on this founder who had started a coffee business, a coffee shop, brick and mortar coffee shop in the pandemic. And it was literally like I met him to have our first session, I guess, our first recording. We were talking about his story. And then 3 weeks later, the pandemic broke out and he was in trouble. So aside from just getting him to talk about it, I also got people from around the industry to talk about it. For example, I got a venture capitalist, an investor in the food industry, to tell me his take on whether this coffee shop would be able to survive. And spoiler alert, it did survive. Flash Coffee is now in multiple areas around Singapore, I think mostly in the CBD area. But it was a great story because I was able to get different perspectives from not just this one founder, but also from people around the industry. Yeah, and the last thing, make sure you talk to the people that you want to podcast for and ask them what they think of your show concept, right? Because if it's all just an idea that lives in your brain the whole time, it might be very differently received once you put it out there, right? So, for example, if you want to podcast for a business audience, set up a coffee meeting with these people, ask them what they think, do up a little Google survey and disseminate it on LinkedIn, and ask them what they want to hear about. You know, it's what we call user tests in the startup world. You need to make sure that you test your product before you put it to the market. You need to make sure there's that product market fit. In this case, it's a content market fit. So take some time to answer these questions. Spend, let's not take 10 minutes. I think we're coming up to the Q&A portion. Let's take 5 minutes to refine some of your brainstormed show concepts and episode topics. And then we will move on to the next segment of this workshop. So just take 5 minutes right now. And if anyone has any questions, if anyone wants to ask how, other people in this call might want to refine their idea, feel free to just start talking.
Hi, Nat. I have another question.
Yes, Reynold, what's up?
Yeah, so actually I just wanted to ask about podcasts in general, and if you find that podcasts will always be fighting indirectly with video, because I mean video comprises audio as well, and you can listen to videos without actually watching the videos too. So yeah, actually I just wanted to ask, maybe is there anything in particular that podcasts have an edge over video, and what sort of content you feel that are more specifically better told, as you mentioned, through audio than with a visual accompaniment, so to speak. Yeah.
Right. That's a very good question, Reynold. One thing, in my experience at least, in which audio beats out video is in that all audio can be listened to as a secondary task while you're doing something else. Video is something you have to dedicate eyes to, right? What we call the listener retention, so how long people listen to podcasts versus how long people watch videos as well, is vastly different. Someone who listens to a podcast would more likely finish an episode versus someone who watches a video where actually in marketing terms, they would often count first 3 seconds, first 10 seconds, first minute. But for podcasts, you count like for the full episode, 70-80% listener retention, right? And that's primarily because you don't have to fully pay attention during a podcast, right? One other thing is that with the lack of that visual aid, if you're a really good interviewer, you can get compelling stories that could not be told via video. Because if you're asking, for example, so I had this one episode where I basically broke the story about Honest Bee's CEO not treating his co-founder very well. And that co-founder, the chief technology officer, was telling me how ever since they had started this company, he had always been mistreated because he was younger. He was the younger of the founders. And so the CEO would always ask him, John, what do you know? Just do your tech thing and I'll do the business thing. And like the way that he said it, with the cracks in his voice, with the pauses, with the long pauses in between sentences, that really lended to the audio experience. And that's something that you could have over video, but like with video, you're expecting things to move a little bit faster, right? You need things to match. For example, if their voice is somber, they need to look somber. And if he's not crying, you're thinking other things like, oh, why is his voice so somber, but he's not crying? Why are there no tears in his eyes? So there's a lot of like distractions when it comes to video that are not present during audio. But primarily, I do think that the main boon is in not having to pay attention so much.
Right. Thank you so much. That was, I didn't think about that at all. The fact that you can just leave it playing somewhere and then just have it on. Yeah,
man, you're ironing your clothes, doing your washing. Like just turn on a podcast. You can't watch a video. You can barely watch Netflix. So
yeah, that's true. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, we have about 30 seconds more until we wrap this activity. Okay, so right now, before I move on to the next one, I do want to ask before that, because we're going to a different thing altogether, whether anyone wants to bounce your ideas off right now and see how you refined it and see whether it could be refined more. If you're still a little bit work in progress, don't worry. Like I have my contact details at the end of this session and you can always send it across to me. But if you have something right now, let me know and I can address it here. If not, we're going to move on to the next one, the next slide.
Sure.
Okay.
Yes, I can share a little bit and try and fine tune my thing.
All right. Tell us first what your concepts and your episodes were and which one you're refining and how you refined them.
Okay, so basically my podcast is pending name, but something probably go along the lines of something like what's your passion? Basically it's for people who have no passions, and I interview people who have found theirs and how people can get started on that road. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of the concept of the show. I interview people who have already found theirs. My idea is to have like one person who is doing it for fun and one person who has turned that hobby into like a job, because people always want to know from like both sides. And I think it's interesting to get like the hobbyist perspective and a professional's perspective on the topic. So every episode, of course, will feature a different hobby. So maybe it's one day it's hiking, next episode is about rollerblading, for example, or miniature painting in the third episode, something like that. So yeah, that's kind of my concept. My other two concepts also riff off like the same idea, but slightly different angle. So the other one is called The Weekend Show. Nothing to do on the weekend. You come on this podcast and learn a new skill right now. So like we interview like somebody like a painter or whatever, and here's like a quick exercise you can do like during the rest of your weekend right now, and maybe you can explore something like that. So those are kind of like my two things. Honestly, I feel like there's a possibility when I can just combine these two in some way or form. But yeah, that's what I.
Do you have any thoughts as to how you might be able to tweak that?
Not right now, no. Maybe I was thinking, maybe in the title I could kind of going back to like my initial target audience, right? They're corporate shows, and they kind of hesitant to do anything. So maybe the title can be something like, hey, if you like music, then the title of the hobby, like dance. If you want to work up a sweat but want to stay cool, Zumba, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. So I imagine the user experience would be like, I go to this podcast and then I see like, all these different hobbies and like who it's best for, and I select the one that I think that's the ones I think are cool and speak to me. Yeah.
Right. That's very interesting, actually. So one thing that I just thought of that you could probably take to maybe tweak your concept is think about how you want to tell those stories, right? So for example, for Startup Snapshot, when I started out, it was purely just an interview format. I just sat down with some guy in a room, brought out the microphone, recorded the session, edited out the awkward silences and the ums and ahs in between our words, and then published it with an intro music and outro music. I didn't do much to really tell a story, right? But then I realized that, and this was my failure, I didn't do market research on what podcasts are out there. I didn't realize that there were already a few other tech entrepreneur podcasts in the market that were more established. So I thought about how then would I differentiate myself from this crowd? And I thought, well, what's unique to me that these other podcasters don't have is that, unlike them, who are mostly VCs or founders in their own right, I am a professional storyteller, right? So instead of, for our second season of Startup Snapshot, instead of just sitting down with someone, recording the whole thing and publishing it, I sat down with them, asked them questions, told them this will be edited like a lot. So even if you say something that you think you shouldn't have said, just let me know, I can edit it out. And then what I did is I laid over narration into the episode when I went to editing. So instead of it being someone listening into a conversation between me and a startup founder, it became me telling a story about someone with the interview spliced in between narrated lines. So that helped to really, one, increase our branding, I guess, as a storyteller, but also increase our listenership, increase our listener retention, because then we're very easily identifiable as the storytelling podcast about entrepreneurship. So you could probably do something like that as well, because there are quite a few hobby-related podcasts in the market, but how you could differentiate yourself is by how you tell those stories. Maybe you don't even have to be in that podcast. You just have the hobbyist and the corporate shill discussing with each other, and the hobbyist is trying to advocate the corporate shill to try out his hobby. Or maybe the corporate shill is just trying to get the hobbyist to like calm down a little bit. So there are a few ways that you could think about how you want to tell that story that would also help you differentiate yourself from the crowd out there.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to have like the TA inside the podcast. I think that'll be fun.
Yeah. So looking forward to if you manage to get that off, definitely let me know. I'll love to hear it. But thank you again for sharing, Nicholas. Anyone else want to share? If not, I'm going to move on to the next bit. Okay. So lastly, now that we've gone through the whole process of audience identification, concept brainstorming, episode topics, your next step will be executing all that, right? But we're going to skip over execution and go to the end of the execution, where you have to start considering your goals and your metrics, right? What are you setting out to achieve? And how do you measure success? Because there's content strategy, and there's no strategy without reassessment and pivoting after every iteration. So depends on whether you want to look for reach. Does that mean that you just want people to see your podcast? listen to it? Do you look for engagement? So you're looking for people to write into you about how they love your podcast, review your podcast. Are you looking for conversion, right? Are you selling something? Is your podcast a way of marketing a product or marketing yourself even, right? How you measure success in reach, engagement, or conversion, or any other method of success will determine how you change your podcast every episode, every season. So make sure that you think about this, when you get to executing your concept that you guys thought of just now. For me, for example, when I started out Startup Snapshot, we went purely by reach. We just wanted people to listen. But then we realized actually at the time, podcasting was such a small market here in Southeast Asia. Not a lot of people listen to podcasts. And out of those people who listen to podcasts, so few of them are in the tech and startup scene. And furthermore, few of them were tech startup founders. So we were looking at a super niche audience. Why were we on a general audience platform like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts? And what we decided to do is to switch our measurement for success from reach to conversion. So we locked Startup Snapshot behind a paywall on the Tech Ninja webpage. And we knew that we had a very small number of followers, but a bunch of followers who were very loyal. Our listener retention was like 80%, 70-80%, which meant that people would be, our hypothesis anyway, was that people would be willing to pay to listen to a podcast. And so when we put it behind the paywall, it worked out. And now, instead of measuring by reach, I don't care now how many people listen to it. I care how many people subscribe to Tech in Asia because they saw that there's a new podcast episode out. So that's how, it might change how you define your content strategy. So the last part of this workshop, I think we're running a little bit over, but we're going to get to Q&A very soon. Last part is the basics for scripting, the best practices for scripting. Now, scripting is a very long process, so I'm not going to go into everything about scripting. I'm not going to get you guys to start a script now, but I'm going to run through the basic skeletal outline for what a script looks like. So essentially, of course, this differs depending on your show format, but typically your flow of your script should go music, intro, your relation to your content, and then your content, which is the bulk of your episode, then the conclusion, an outro, and then music, right? So music and intro and outro as well, those are your brand. When a listener hears it, they know what they're in for. Like if they had a shuffled queue of podcasts and then the next one was your music, they immediately know what they're listening to. Relation and conclusion, a lot of people skim over these, but it is actually very important because within the first few minutes, a listener determines whether they want to listen to this or not, or they will skip it. So you need to make sure that in your relation, you're telling them why this topic of this podcast episode is important. And then it goes into your content. And then your conclusion as well, because they've been listening to your episode for maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. It's important to conclude the episode and let them know what they learned in this episode. Because like we were talking about just now, podcasts aren't a high attention medium, right? So you have to let them know, like catch them up on what they might have missed while they were ironing their clothes, doing their laundry, whatever. And then also make sure that you outro and you put in your stinger music again at the end, because that again is your brand. Of course, this flow isn't set in stone. You can craft your script flow according to your audience's preference. I'll show you some examples later on, but some rules of thumb to follow. Make sure that you get to the bulk of your content within 2 minutes of hitting play, right? Because if it takes longer than 2 minutes to get to the content topic, people will be like, okay, the rest of the episode is going to be this draggy, I'm out. All right. And second, make sure that the story moves along every 90 to 120 seconds. This can be difficult if you're doing an interview-based podcast, because then that means you have to be looking at your watch every 90 seconds, 120 seconds. So what I recommend is that you fix this in post, You fix this in the editing studio. Make sure that every roughly 90 to 120 seconds, something happens to move the story forward, right? I'm gonna show you some examples of some scripts just so that you know what I mean by like intro and like 2 minutes and like 9 seconds. So here is the script for a recent episode of Deep Dive, my spin-off podcast, where it's actually last month's episode where I talked about Stripe and its entry into Indonesia. So I'm gonna play the file here and you guys can read the script. Excited.
This episode is brought to you by HVR. Fresh data when you need it. More on that in a bit, but first, on with the show. Hello and welcome to Deep Dive, a show where we discuss the biggest headlines to hit the startup scene with the journalists who broke the stories. My name's Nat, and today we're going to talk about the Silicon Valley fintech giant's foray into the Indonesian fintech space. I'm talking about the US's most valuable private company, Stripe. Over the past year, Stripe has been stepping up its efforts in its Indonesian entry, targeting key positions like legal counsel, key accounts manager, and expansion partnership lead for early hires. However, rolling out its core payment gateway business in the country will be no small feat. All the complex legal legwork that comes with being a foreign fintech aside, Stripe also has to contend with a number of ambitious local players who've recently received big capital injections in the fintech space. My colleague, Tech and Asia journalist RD Wardana, joins me for the story. Yeah, thanks RD for taking the time to
Okay,
speak.
so that's that episode. So as you can see, it starts with music, and there was an ad as well. But it starts with music, it goes into intro, and then I straight away talk about the relation, what this episode is going to be about and why it's important, right? And then within 1 minute and 30 seconds, I'm at content. So that makes sure that things move pretty quickly, make sure that the listener doesn't feel like things are dragging. And this is typically the flow that most podcasts will follow. Now, I did get a question in chat about some podcasts having intros with excerpts of the content, and some have standardized intros. How should you go about picking? This is a very interesting question because actually, when I started out Startup Snapshot, we started with excerpts of the content. And then when we did that, we realized that it didn't really work for our audience. And that might be because our audience is a business audience, right? And they need things to flow a little bit smoother for them to understand what's going on. For other audiences, maybe they might, this approach might appeal to them because they get a feel of like what's going to be in the episode. These excerpts of the content are essentially the relation segment of that content flow that we talked about earlier. So you're moving the relation in front, and then music, and then intro, and then content, right? So it depends on your audience. Largely, it will come down to trying and testing. We tried it. It didn't really work for us. We decided to go with the one that I showed earlier, which is the music, intro, relation, content, and then conclusion, outro music. So I'd recommend just trying it out, or even just asking your audience before you try it out what they think would work better for them, right? So thank you for that question, Chin En. So this one, like I mentioned before, very typical flow. But what I did for the Grab podcast, we took a less typical approach because it was more storytelling driven rather than like news driven, right? So this one is about a mid 20-year-old tech professional and how she's navigating the corporate world. Let's give this one a quick listen.
Remember being in your mid-20s? Where were you then? Personally, I'd just started my first full-time job, writing weekly newsletters for a media relations company. I honestly had no idea what I was doing or even what I wanted to do as a career. Karina Lai is in kind of the same situation as I was back then, currently at her first job since graduation, except prior to this, she'd also had several notable internships at consulting firms and one at a venture capital firm.
To be honest, when I was in college, I was one of those kids who doesn't really know kind of what to be once I graduated. So I think that's one of the reasons as well why I then decided to did a lot of internships in a lot of different companies from different industries as well. So I was just trying to see like which kind of career path, which kind of job, and which kind of industry suits me the best.
One graduation and 4 internships later, however, Karina is now a senior product manager at Grab and has led major projects at the tech unicorn, including the launch of its self-onboarding feature for merchants on the Grab Merchant app. And all that at just 24 years old. From Tech in Asia and Grab, this is How She Made It, a podcast that tells the stories of the innovative women behind one of Southeast Asia's biggest tech startups.
Okay, so as you can see, like I took a different approach with this one. Why we took a different approach is that we didn't have a set brand for this podcast yet. Like I mentioned later on in the script, this is episode 2, right? So having that music in, especially for a limited series, not the biggest priority. What is the more of a priority is making sure that you're getting the listeners hooked, right? So right at the start, we put in the relation, which you can also do similarly with like an excerpt of some of the content. And then it goes into the opening music and then the intro of the episode. And then we go back to the content, right? So you can take this approach. This is an approach that a lot of other highly edited and highly produced podcasts do it. If anyone is familiar with Gimlet Media, this is the template that they usually go with, right? They put in a hook, a nice hook at the start, so that people are already interested. And when they're listening to the opening music and the intro, they're not like, let's just get this over with, because they're already invested in the content. Another example I'm going to show you is from The Daily at the New York Times. Really good podcast that tells the news. And why I want to show this is because when you listen to the intro, you kind of already like know that it's The Daily. So there's another ad in this one, but let's listen through it and then you'll see.
Some say Colombia is without a doubt the most welcoming of countries, a place where check-in means welcome and check-out means come back soon, where modern cities will surprise you with an endless supply of urban adventures, while quaint heritage towns greet you across insanely photogenic streets, and where the people are brimming with talent, innovative ideas, and lots of opportunities for great business. Why not come find out for yourself? Visit Colombia, the most welcoming place on earth.
From the New York Times, I'm Sabrina Tavernisi. This is The Daily. Today, a Times investigation shows that police killed 400 unarmed drivers or passengers during traffic stops over the last 5 years. I spoke to my colleague, David Kirkpatrick, about why so many traffic stops go wrong and why the problem is so hard to fix. It's Monday, November 1st.
Right? So as you can see with that one, and if you listen to The Daily, you'll notice that there are some phrases that they repeat over and over again, episode to episode. Like from the New York Times, I'm Sabrina Tavernisi. This is The Daily. You'll find that in every episode. Even if the host changes, they'll just change the name, but the intro is always the same. And the way they do the relation is always the same as well. It's today, this happened, this happened, this happened. I spoke to this person to talk about this. It's a very easy to follow format. It's easy to understand what the episode is going to be about. And then the intro ends off with, it's Monday, November 1. And that is their brand, right? Because it's The Daily. They have one episode every day. And then they go to the content. David, where did you start this investigation? So think about how you might integrate some of these characteristics into your own intros, into your own relations, because the best and the most well-known podcasts have these phrases that they use in every intro and every outro that help audiences identify them better. And that will really help with getting people hooked, getting people invested in your content, and refining your content strategy. So actually, that's pretty much it for scripting and for the rest of this workshop. So I'm going to open the floor now to questions. Feel free to type them into the chat. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. And I'll try to answer as many as I can before we have to end this workshop. Raven, quick time check. What time should we close this off?
Hi. Okay. Thanks for sharing your insights and expertise, Nat. We can have because we start a bit late, so I think it's okay. Maybe we can end about 4. Do you think if it's okay with everyone, we'll run the Q&A until about 4? Yeah.
Yep. So we'll be running for about 15 minutes.
Yes.
So feel free to ask us your questions.
Yeah.
Anything about starting your content strategy, how to identify your audience better, or even scripting, or even just general questions about podcasting, I'm happy to answer them right now.
Okay, maybe I'll start the first question to get everyone rolling. So what are you working on right now actually for Tech in Asia?
What I'm working on right now.
New projects like short form podcasts coming up. Yeah.
We're working on a couple of different podcast ideas actually. So one that we're already working on for next year, we just kicked off this project, is a mental health podcast for business leaders. Because Mental Health Awareness Month in the US is May. So we're trying to make sure that we hit May for release. We'll have weekly episodes then. So it'll be a limited series, potentially looking for sponsors for that. I'm also at the same time working on the 4th season of Startup Snapshot, which we're getting a new host to host it. We're basically trying to experiment with different hosts, a larger team, so we can rationalize hiring me a team and I'm not alone anymore. So that's actually what I'm working on right now. I see Reynold has his hand raised and Incy has a question. So I think I saw Reynold first. So Reynold, could you just
you can ask in
unmute
first, it's
yourself?
okay. You can answer
Incy.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the case that we are reporting on real life events or things that can be considered controversial, what are the pointers we can remember so we can avoid litigation or lawsuits from others? Fortunately for me, my company retains a lawyer. So oftentimes when it's so sensitive of nature, we consult our lawyer and we ask them about it. But what you can do is just make sure that common practice in journalism is that you educate your interviewees on what it means to be on the record, off the record, for context, or on background, right? So on the record means that whatever they say is usable in your story. So oftentimes when you ask this question, make sure that you get it on the recording. Like you start off, hey, so everything right now is on the record. If you need anything to be off the record or need anything to be on background or just for context, let me know, right? And then off the record means they're telling you, but you're not allowed to use that information in your story and you're not allowed to quote them. On background means that similarly, you're not supposed to identify them, but you can use that to follow up with someone else who might be willing to go on record. For context, it just means that they will give you better context for an answer that you have that might not be very clear, but you're still not allowed to like identify them. So as long as you follow these rules, you should be able to avoid litigation or lawsuits from people. One common practice as well that is, it's more of a individual preference than it is a rule. If I'm publishing something that might be maybe potentially controversial for this one individual, I let that individual know. I make it clear that they are not in any way going to be able to change any of the content because it has to retain its journalistic integrity, but I'm giving him a heads up so that he can do something about it. right? For example, if it's about a company and the CEO is being immoral or being careless with the way he runs his business, we will send them a note saying, hey, we're publishing this story, just giving you the heads up, common courtesy. You can do that as well to avoid litigation. I hope that answers your question. But honestly, best way, get a lawyer. But not everyone can afford to get a lawyer every time they have a controversial story. So just make sure that you follow a journalistic process. Yeah. So Reynold, you have a question, yes?
Yes, I do. I have two questions, but I'll ask one first. So just some background. The podcast I intend to do is actually to interview people with interesting jobs, because for many my target audience are essentially students, right? Who have no idea what they want to do in the future, and oftentimes we are hit with the advice like do what you love, but as young people, how the heck are we supposed to know what we love, right? So the podcast aims to help young people find out what they like by exposing them to a bunch of different career types. So so essentially the tone I want to give off during the interview is more like a big brother sort of bringing his younger sibling to the coffee shop and then talking to this guy who's been working for a while already. So do you have any tips on how to make, especially if we are interviewing someone we don't know, right? Any tips on how to break the ice initially so that the conversations moves more naturally and doesn't sound like an interview, you know?
Right. How to make the interview sound like a conversation and not like an interview?
Yeah.
The cheat way, before I say the real way, the cheat way is to edit your podcast. So initially, when I was starting out and wasn't so confident, I would, because I'd have separate mics for me and my interviewee, my input would go into something else. Theirs would go into the recording. And then I would re-record my questions to them and my reactions to those answers.
Oh.
But this was when I was interviewing journalists for Deep Dive, because we were experimenting with a more free flow show rather than something as structured as Startup Snapshot, where there's narration with excerpts of interviews spliced in between. So the people that I was interviewing at the time were my colleagues. So that was a little bit more fine for me to like, oh, I'm going to use your answers, but I'm going to rephrase my questions and all that. The actual way to get someone comfortable and get someone talking freely and making the interview sound great is to have a little bit of foreplay before the interview. So this can be done with one, sending them the list of questions that you have, giving them an out on questions that they don't want to answer, leaving the floor open to them for anything that they might want to say that might not be covered by the questions, and generally like giving them an opportunity to craft that conversation with you rather than you being alone and crafting the conversation, right? So sending a pre-interview prep questions and all that would be great. Another way that we do it, and this one is usually something that we do when we're at Tech in Asia, that we do when we're producing videos, so like documentary series and stuff like that. We have pre-interviews beforehand. So we actually do a dry run of the conversation and see whether it works. We take notes on what works, what we should take out, and then we what else we should add, and then we do the whole thing again as the proper recording. So you can do that because that puts people at ease. It helps them to feel like they already know you and they already know what they're going to say because they've said it before. And yeah, so that's another way that you can do that. But generally, all you have to do to get someone comfortable during an interview is constant affirmation, right? So, for example, if you're in an interview and someone says like, "Hi, my name is Elon Musk and I run Tesla," you can be like, "Tesla, wow, amazing! And I heard you run PayPal as well before." And he's like, "Yeah, actually." So like you get them like confident. You help them feel good by affirming them and affirming their answers. But you have to be an active listener to do this, right? Because if they say like, oh, and yeah, like my business failed in 6 months, and you're like, wow, it's just the wrong tone, right? You have to be like, oh man. So I can imagine that was an incredible stress for you. What did you do about it? So you have to practice this. What I did to my poor friends before was that in conversations with them, I would treat it like an interview, and then I would like be extra affirming and extra engaged in conversation with them. But I think that's a very good way to get someone comfortable with speaking with you.
Right, right. Okay, those were very good tips. Thank you so much. Perhaps just one more. I don't want to hog up too much time. Just a very simple one. Just from your experience, how long does it take you to prep for an interview or for a podcast episode, and how long does it take for you to edit one?
Prepping for an interview depends on your approach. I used to take a very heavy prep approach to interviews, but now I tend to try to go in blind, so that my reaction to answers or my questions come off more organically. But that's also when I'm doing like full interview recording. My biggest time spent is actually not on interviews or production, but it's actually research and trying to find people to be on my podcast. So like that story identification takes up the most of my time. For the production end, even though I edit the podcast by myself at the moment, I will take about a day or two to script after the interviews are done and then just work on it in Adobe Audition.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
No worries. We have a couple questions from Jeremiah. Quick question: when finding your niche and podcast
can
format,
I just jump in? Jeremiah,
Yes.
do you want to speak instead? Rather than, since the questions are so long, do you want to unmute your mic?
Sure. Hey everyone. Hey Nathaniel.
Jeremiah.
Thank you so much for the session so far. So my quick question, right? When finding your niche and podcast format treatment, this is a two-parter. Okay, so the first question, the first part is, how do you know if your format and treatment is working? Second follow-up question to that is, if it doesn't work, when do you make the judgment call or decision to change the show format and treatment? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah. Those are very good questions. Unfortunately, the answer is you don't know until you try. And this is the case for my experience as well. Even though I could have conducted better market research to understand that there are already podcasts about tech and startups in the industry, I would have never thought to change my treatment as a way to try to differentiate myself. At the beginning anyway. So honestly, what you have to do is to try, before you launch your podcast, think about what your goals are. So for reach, how many downloads do you want to attain within 3 episodes? Or how many followers do you want to have on Spotify? How many downloads do you want on Apple Podcasts? Do you want to rank among the top podcasts in Apple Podcasts? And then once you hit that benchmark for like, okay, 3 episodes are up, where am I right now? Look at whether you have hit your goals and whether you have fallen short. And if that happens to have fallen short, you have to then ask yourself, is it because your goal is too high? Or is it because you didn't do enough of something? Is something not working? So oftentimes I'll keep my goal there, keep it the same, and then I'll tweak the format a little bit. Change something. Try to identify the pain points in or the pain points in listening to your podcast, right? So what I did is I spoke to a lot of listeners. I had to get their feedback. I would play a podcast in front of them while sitting at Starbucks and then watch them as they reacted to it, even by just their face. If they seemed to be bored or they seem to be trying to put on a smile to act engaged, then I know at that part someone was not listening enough. You can also check out, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, they do show you data for like where listeners drop off, and you can identify, okay, something I said here did not match a listener's expectations for what should have been said, and then there you can start to tweak things slowly. So that's how I would answer the first question. Not a very satisfying answer, but honestly, it's hard to strike success the first time. If it doesn't work, when do you make the decision to change the show format and treatment? I'd say immediately. Of course, you have to identify that it's a trend that's happening. So not just a one-off, but when a one-off happens, you have to keep your eye on it. And then you have to test it again. Does the same thing, your hypothesis for why this one-off didn't work, does that apply to this other episode? And then if it applies for another episode, then you know that that's the problem. But don't take too long to identify what's wrong. Just change something, because it's better to have a more exploratory approach to things rather than like always sticking to the same format and hoping that it'll work out if you just do it enough times. Yeah, I hope that answers your questions, Jeremiah.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much. But can you humor me for another follow-up question?
Yes,
if
sure.
there's time. So in terms of podcasting, right? It always says that consistency is key. But when do you know when your consistency is garbage? And that's when should you change? Because I mean, people, or no, not people, but I mean, Einstein said doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome is insanity. But when exactly do we know when we are sane and when are we insane?
Right. So riding on that Einstein quote, if your consistency is leading to negative performance, change something. If your consistency is leading to positive performance, don't change anything. So for example, when I launched Startup Snapshot, our listenership was flat. And then when we did our second season, it improved. But then towards the middle of the second season, it started to deprove again. So then we looked at, okay, is it that the content is not deep enough? Is it the listening experience? And then we changed some things. And then in season 3, we launched with a very different treatment, very different approach. And that was when we started to hit gold and start improving episode on episode. So it's really very situational, very case by case. But I would say that as long as your consistency is not leading to bad results, go ahead with consistency. If your consistency is leading to a diving listenership number, then change something, change anything.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nathaniel. Appreciate it.
Thank you for asking that question. We have reached 4 o'clock, but Raven, if it's okay, I don't mind if anyone has one more question.
Yes, we can take one last question for any. Yeah, so if anyone has a burning last question, it's your time to ask. I think we have okay. Anyone? Last question, last chance.
If you can't think of questions now, I think that's fine as well. You can always find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yes.
Who's this?
So hi everyone, I'm Jinan. So I think one question I have is, how do you, or what metrics should we be looking at to measure the podcast to know whether it's working or not? Because my understanding of podcasts, it's very different from like a blog, right? Where you just look at page clicks or YouTube video views, as you mentioned. So I guess what metrics and also what's good, especially for those of us who are launching for the first time. Like what are some benchmarks or ballparks that would tell us, okay, you're doing a good job, you're doing an okay job, you're doing a not so good job?
Okay, very good question. So there's another question from Callie as well, and I'll get to that real quick. But so what metrics should you measure your podcast by depends on the purpose of your podcast. Like we mentioned earlier in the goals and metrics portion, it really depends on what your podcast is for. If your podcast is purely content, and this is just a project, on its own, it's not attached to any primary objective, then I would say go by reach, right? So how many listeners you have, how many downloads you have, that would be a good indicator to start looking at. But when we're talking about what's a good number to say that is like a little bit of a success, I think that really depends on your topic. For example, when my podcast started out, when we got 100 downloads for the first episode, we went insane. We were like, oh wow, that's so much more than we expected. We thought like 30 people would listen in. And then when we got to the third episode and like it was still 100, then we're like, okay, something's going wrong because our listenership is not improving, it's staying the same. So it really depends on like what what they call total addressable market is. For example, like I mentioned before, the number of people who listen to podcasts, and then in that number, the number of people who are in the tech and startup scene, and then in that number, the number of people who are founders and entrepreneurs, very small. So for me, I'm comfortable with like 1,000 listens, 2,000 listens. That's like great for me. But for a general audience podcast, if you're just talking about like things that are happening around the world, it's something that is accessible to a global audience, and you only have 1,000, 2,000, then you should be thinking about what's going wrong or whether you should be going niche, right? If your podcast is a method of marketing, either marketing yourself as a professional, marketing your business, marketing any other thing, it should be conversions that are your primary metric for success. You don't have to care about people listening to your podcast. You care about how many of those who listen actually bother going to your website or checking you out on LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever. So it's conversions, because that would mean if you're not getting conversions, but you're having a lot of downloads, that means that your content is engaging, but it doesn't lead people to you. If it has very few downloads, but out of those maybe 50 downloads, 40 of them reached out to you, that means you're converting very well. I hope that answers your question.
Got it. That's very helpful. Thank you very much, Matt.
Okay. And I think last one from Callie was the best tip you will give to a new podcaster. If you're new, the best thing I can say to you is to keep in touch with everyone here, with the tele group that was mentioned earlier, and talk to each other in your project development, in your podcast development, because while you're producing this podcast and all of you are new, you all can provide feedback to each other. You all can help each other grow. The podcast scene is so small that helping any other podcaster helps yourself. You're basically creating new audience for them and a potential new audience for yourself. So that's the biggest and the best tip I will give to a new podcaster. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, Raven, I think I'm handing it back over to you. But if anyone wants to find me, my LinkedIn is there. If you scan the QR code, it leads to my podcast on Spotify. So thanks so much for taking the time to visit my session, and I hope you guys learned a lot from me.
Thank you, Nat. I think it's been really useful, and I think in terms of for beginner podcasters, coming out with the content strategy is one of the toughest things. Like it's like a thing that people don't tell you. I mean, together with how to structure your podcast and stuff, like there's so much info out there, but it's very hard to find info specifically on just how to, plan out a podcast, in terms of content. So I'm glad we managed to get Nat to come to this session and do his presentation. I'm so sorry for all the technical problems we faced just now. So as I mentioned, there will be because some of you missed some of the session, and then there are others who are unable to make it. So we will make this session available for a short period so that you guys can rewatch it and catch up. And I strongly recommend you guys to connect with Nat, keep in touch, and also to listen to all the podcasts from Tech in Asia. We also have evaluation forms, so if you could help us fill out the evaluation forms, that'd be great, so that we know what you like and how we can plan for future programs as well. And of course, if you are Singaporean and PR, and if you use a grant, you definitely need to fill out this form so that you can get your claims back. Yeah, so for Singaporeans and PRs, please use the form on the left, and then for everybody else, you can use it on the right to give us like feedback on the session, how we can do better, how we can cater more content, and how we can help you as well. Thank you so much, everyone. So I hope you guys have a great day. And and for some of you may be coming back tomorrow. So if that's the case, I'll see you tomorrow then. Thank you very much.